Welcome, Bernardo. Thank you for joining us today for this session on conversations on PhD and what it takes for you to see your thesis through. I have known you since 2023 when you started, and there's a quote that you always bring up, and I'd like to hear more and more about it over the years and how it progresses. So you usually say that all forms of discrimination is violence, but not all form of violence is discrimination. And I would like you to give us an overview of what your thesis is all about before we move on to other nuances of your thesis. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you for inviting me and having me here talk about my thesis. And thank you for the question. I think it's very central to my thesis. This is my central premise. So the idea was, and I wish I could elaborate more on my thesis in terms of the context, but the idea was when I was thinking of applying and I was thinking of projects on my PhD project, I was thinking about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, which are very, they're a very direct and very clear case both of violence but of discrimination. So it seems like a case of discrimination and a case of racism, a case of violence it's very palpable. And then I thought, how can I link this with, let's say, workplace discrimination? Someone not getting promoted because they're a woman or because they were pregnant or because they have a disability, which is more insidious. You don't get the blood, you don't get the headline. So I was trying to think of how can I link both, because both are cases of discrimination, and one of the theory that supports this idea is Galtung. So Johann Galtung has this theory of violence that he says that violence is direct, cultural, and structural, or structural cultural, depending on how you want to put it. And then I thought this is a great idea for me to understand discrimination. And what I did is I linked Galtung's theory with this idea of discrimination. So I came up with this broader idea and the premise that every act of discrimination is an act of violence, but not every act of violence will be an act of discrimination. And I remember that one of the first, questions about it was my co-supervisor. She asked me, "Well, but I don't agree because you're thinking about harm, and harm is different from violence." And I said, no, this is the thing. This is not about harm, because violence in Galtung's term is different. So direct violence can be, murder. So George Floyd is a case of direct violence. It can be microaggression. So let's say if you are at work and someone is always making little jokes and is making you feel, lesser because of whatever reason, racism, homophobia, transphobia, whatever. You have cultural violence that are the big stereotypes. It's racism itself. It's the big ones. And you have structural. So you have hiring practices from from a certain company. You have courts not recognizing someone's right. So by his terms, violence is much broader than just someone being harmed. The harms are much more they're enlarged by his views, and by doing that, I think discrimination, or I'm trying to make discrimination more complex in the sense that it's more layered, it's more refined. It's not just the denial of the right. It's not just someone not getting the job. You have to look further and you have to analyze it better. So yeah, that's the intent of the research. But yeah.
I like it how the thesis sounds like you're walking through complexity, and quite good, quite good. So your research proposes a taxonomy of discrimination in international human rights law. What motivated you to create an entirely new conceptual tool, and what gap particularly does it fill in existing scholarship? Is that something that you've thought of?
Yes, definitely. And
Mhm.
first, I have to say that I think I told you, or if I didn't, I was presenting my taxonomy in a conference, and then at the end, someone said, "Oh, no, no, really great work. I love your taxidermy," and I was like, "Oh my God, it's not taxidermy, it's taxonomy." So yeah, I
Yeah, not
don't
a
do
taxidermist.
animals.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, just to
That would be
simplify,
much more
people.
complex. That
Yeah,
would like, yeah,
I
yeah.
wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it at all. Yeah, but I like to say that that taxonomies are, just a pretentious classification. I'm a little pretentious, people say, so it's a pretentious classification. But the idea is that taxonomy has hierarchies. Classification, you just, put the concepts.
Yeah,
But yeah,
it's,
yeah. So the idea was that I was very frustrated with like how anti-discrimination law operates, because especially in international human rights law, it tends to see discrimination in single axis. So what I mean by single axis is either you're discriminated because of your gender or your race or your disability. Uh, but when you look at real cases, real life cases, the experiences are much more complex, and discrimination never appears or happens in a clean, isolated way. And it's shaped by people's histories and structures. We're talking about structures, so structures, and there doesn't seem to be a methodology to see this much more refined, layered uh, experiences. So I wanted to give courts, and when I say courts, it seems like I'm just catering to judges and courts, but when I say courts, I'm saying courts and claimants and people who go in front of courts and lawyers. So, the judicial system in a broader sense. So giving courts and people who are going to go to courts and lawyers and clerks and etc. Something practical for them to see that, but without losing the complexity of discrimination as I see it. Uh, and that's the idea of the taxonomy. The taxonomy is just, and it just with a lot of inverted commas, is a map. It's trying to map this to make it simpler for the courts, and again, courts here in a broader sense, to see that in a systematic, in a transparent way. And I think that resonates with people's lived experiences. So it's again, it sometimes I think it's very ambitious, and sometimes I think it's not ambitious at all, because what I'm trying to do is to help courts. But to do that, I have to be very didactic. I have to be very, very conscious of not flattening people's experiences. So it is both ambitious and not. So it's a strange endeavor, I think.
You've mentioned Johann Galton's theory of violence, and it seems like it informs your thesis quite deeply. So, how does mapping discrimination through you've mentioned direct, structural, and cultural violence, how does it reshape what we can think as you said, structure, like the entire spectrum? How does it reshape how we think what discrimination counts as?
Yeah, so he has this triangle of violence, and he says that direct violence is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just what is most commonly that you can most commonly see in society. Uh, and generally, cultural and structural violence, they tend to be invisible. And the way that he puts is that direct violence is when things get really, really bad. But violence is not just the visible part. So again, taking the Black Lives Matters, taking George Floyd, but there are many cases within that period. The murder itself is a direct violence, but racism and the historical racism that happens in the United States and it happens in a lot of countries, but in that context, we're talking about, the historical racism in the United States. That is the cultural and the structural violence. So in the structural violence, you would have the police. How police forces have a more aggressive, discriminatory way of treating Black people in the United States. And in a cultural sense, you would have stereotypes and you have racism itself. So by stretching, by having this zoom out, I would say, you look at in a broader sense, you can see that George Floyd's murder or someone's murdered by racism in the United States it's not just a murder, and it's not just a murder caused by racism. Actually, this is a much more complex picture. This is a picture of structural violence. So you have a police force that it doesn't really understand or doesn't really care about Black people's lives, and you have the cultural part of it, that is how historically racism is part of the discourse in the United States. And I think it's something powerful when you reframe this. So I always say, when you think about it, again, let's go to workplace discrimination. You can see workplace discrimination as, and I'm quoting here myself, so someone lost a job. You can see it just like this. Or you can see as someone or the job was denied because of systematic barriers within that specific company, and because of biases and cultural and stereotypical biases within the hiring committee that led to the denial. So when you reframe discrimination that way, you see that it's much more complex. So it was not, John got the job, was denied the job. It was John was denied the job because this company has a track record of denying jobs for people who have disabilities, and people who have disabilities are seen as less capable. So there's this cultural aspect. So it's trying to make it trying to fit this into people's lived experiences, which are much more complex than just one single act.
Interesting and insightful. Over the years, which so far, I'd say 3 years going on into the fourth, you've mentioned intersectionality, and it also it is also key, or should I say perhaps central to your thesis. How do you deal with the challenge of translating these deeply contextual sociopolitical concepts, as perhaps even from the previously mentioned question, into the formal world of international law, as you said you want to inform the larger spectrum of legal, should I say the legal fraternity?
Yeah. So it's a very complicated thing, I would say, like you said, and you're making really good questions. Thank you. I would say that intersectionality is central to my work. Really, is the theory that, I mean, I am going to use Hillary Charlesworth's idea of my methodology is very much a magpie. So I take a little bit of queer theory, I take a little bit of critical race theory, I take a little bit of law and context, but at the center of it is intersectionality. The problem with intersectionality, and this goes to my why did I do the taxonomy, was that a lot of times, and you can see the treaties, the European Convention of Human Rights, what happens when intersectionality became a thing, when Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term in '89, and it became part of the discourse in the '90s and early aughts, and it became a huge thing, was that it became a checklist. So as if I gave to you, Isaac, I gave to you like a paper, and it's like, look at the paper and mark all the possible ways that you are discriminated. So yes, a checklist, I'm this and I'm that and I'm that. And it's not like intersectionality is not that. And this is the thing, is trying to translate intersectionality in a way that is faithful to what intersectionality actually means. Intersectionality means the intersection. So when Crenshaw coined the term, and she didn't invent the concept. I love Crenshaw, with all justice to Crenshaw. She was, a genius in conception engineering, which we're going to be talking a little bit about later, probably. Is She was a genius in coining the term and seeing and creating something that made people actually see the concept and the idea, but the idea already existed. But I think is a big challenge to, and this is what I try to bring with the taxonomy, for the courts not to see intersectionality. So if someone makes an intersectional claim, so if they say, well, I didn't get a job, or I was fired because I was a pregnant woman. I got pregnant, and I'm a woman, and this is this particular job that I get, that only men, and they do not understand that I could go on maternity leave and I could come back and there's absolutely no problem. The fact is that it's not because I am a woman plus I was pregnant. It's because being a pregnant woman is a different experience from being a man and from being a woman who's not pregnant. And that, granularity, I think, is important. So I try to, and I do pay a lot of respect to Black feminism, which where intersectionality came from. I try to, and this is something that I battled a lot in my thesis, and that I still struggle with in terms of internally, is that there are voices within the Black feminist movement that if you work with intersectionality and you are not a Black woman, obviously, that you are co-opting somehow the theory. I don't believe in that. I think theories, when they're really good, and I think intersectionality is a really good tool, is a really good methodology, they should be used by whomever wants to. And I think my idea is to bring more equality, so I don't think it's my positionality is particularly cooptive of the narrative, but I struggle with that. But and I do think intersectionality has a really powerful place, but it has been used in a very, very simplistic way by lawmakers, by courts, as I was talking, like a checklist. And I think this is sad, right?
So far, you've mentioned the European Court of Human Rights and a little bit of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I take it that you analyze both of these courts. What is the most striking difference in terms of how these courts understand and adjudicate discrimination? What have you pinpointed out?
Yeah, no, it is very interesting. It's sad that sometimes I have to tell people or remind people that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights exists, which I also should say, the African Court, the human rights, but the courts of the rights of man also exist, is really powerful. Because of the scope of my research, I would have loved to put cases of the African court, but thesis, I was already over my limit, so I would have loved to do it, because I think each court, we have three systems, right? So we have the African, the Inter-American, and the European. They have their particularities, even if they copied, especially the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, it copied its model almost it was almost a complete Xerox of the European Court of Human Rights. But what happened, and it was really interesting, is you're looking, even if you took, and I think it was the way it was done. So the Inter-American Court of Human Rights began operating in 1979, and even if you copied and you took, the Strasbourg court and you put it in Latin America, it wouldn't be the same. Why? Because you're judging different people. You're judging a different region with a different history. So what ended up happening is that you have a court, and in my thesis, I look at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in cases that deal with indigenous communities, whereas in the European Court, I deal with transgender cases. But when you look at it, and not talking specifically about indigenous and transgender cases, what you see in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, you see that first they're really bold, they're a really progressive court in the sense that they like to name things, they are not afraid to name things. And because of the history of the region, so again, it starts operating in the late, I would say in the 80s, 79 is almost 80s.
Yeah.
So they start operating in a moment where the dictatorships, the military dictatorships in the region are starting to break. So the cases tend to be about, forced disappearances. What is a forced disappearance? Is a murder. Is a murder by state. I love the idea of forced disappearance. How do you make someone be forced disappear forcibly?
Yes.
It's a murder.
Yeah.
But and you can see in the evolution of the court that they can't just look at someone's murdered by the state. You have to understand why was that dictatorship in place, or what was that happening. So the way I see is that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is very vocal and it tends to be more explicit to recognize historical injustice, structural discrimination, which is something that it's very dear to my thesis. Whereas, and again, because of what it deals with indigenous communities, with Afro-descendant populations. So because they're really focused on that, the product tends to be really different. Whereas the European Court of Human Rights, is a more cautious court, a more individualized court. So it tends to be more focused on the facts. They don't tend to try to give broader messages. I think also the problem, I say is a problem, but it might not be, some people might not see as a problem, but the doctrine of, the discretionary position. So the court cannot go into national courts or the national legislation. So if a country does not recognize gay marriage, this is a discretionary matter. So basically the European Court says we can't do anything. Sorry, there was a discrimination in the case. This is this is something that that national legislation, national courts have to do, which I find it. I'll be bold because I'm talking about the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and talk about being bold. I think it's a coward move, because if you're a court that deals with human rights and you see that in that case there was a problem because there's a lack of recognition by the law in a certain country, you can't just put your hands up and say, well, sorry, this is a discretionary matter. Each country decides how they want. Well, if the countries decided to sign the treaty and be part of the European Court of Human Rights system, they can't say, and you're a lawyer, understand this, they can't just afterwards turn around and say, well, but actually, I really want my national laws to be recognized, and they can't be interfered. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yes.
So that's the thing. So either you're part of the court or you're not. So one of the countries that was one of the biggest violators in the number of violations that the European Court of Human Rights saw was Russia. Russia was the leading violator of human rights, and in 2022, it just left the court. I'm not saying that it's good. A lot of violations are still happening in Russia, but it's a national thing. So if you're continuously violating and you don't want to abide by the court and you really don't care about human rights violations, just leave. I think it is, at least for me, it's a more honest way of dealing than to have it and say, well, I'm part of the European Court of Human Rights, but I will not. I reserve the right not to have my national legislation be under the scrutiny of the court. I think that's complicated. But again, you have to see each court in its context, right?
You've mentioned that you have cases from Latin America. What do Global South perspectives reveal that traditional human rights scholarship often overlook?
That's a really great question. I think it reveals that inequality is not incidental. It is produced. It is something that it doesn't just happen. Oh, it's just a case. No, it's part of something bigger. So when we see, I think Global South jurisprudence, especially in discrimination, shows that colonial histories, economic exploitations, racial hierarchies, like I said, structural violence, these are the reasons why discrimination happens. And another thing is that I think Global South, so either the African Court of the Rights of Man and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, they're both very creative in terms of legal interpretations and legal solutions. So, for example, in terms of community-centered approaches. So if you're dealing with an indigenous community case, it's very complicated for you not to give a community-based response. Another thing is to again, collective remedies. Another thing that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights does that I think it's amazing, it actually gives awards financial remedies to the claimants, which I think makes a lot of sense. So if someone, and it may not solve the issue, but let's say if someone was denied the right to have a medical procedure, and that ended up casing a disability, ended up occurring in the person with disability. So if that happens, why can't the most important court in the region award damages? Why? I think it's amazing, and I think the European Court of Human Rights should award damages. A lot of people would say not, but I think it is a very creative way. And I think the Global South, like I said, both the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and I'm not trying to be biased because I think the African court also presents a lot of legal creativity, and that idea that law is not neutral and the systems are not neutral. It reflects social history, and I think both courts tend to be very aware of that in their decisions, and I think the European Court could learn a lot from that. And just to say, I know I talk too much, but when there are studies, and I should know the names of people, but I'm terrible with names of people. But you can see there are studies that both the African Court and the Inter-American Court, they cite a lot the European Court of Human Rights in their decisions, but the opposite is not true. So the European Court of Human Rights rarely cites the other two courts, which shows not only a problem of certain discrimination in itself, but also how much it's not learning, because the systems should be dialoguing with themselves. I think national courts should be dialoguing with other national courts. But if we have three systems, and we should have more systems, but we have three systems, it's not a lot. So, courts should be able to cite the other courts. So I think there's also this transborder collective acknowledgement that both the African and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights do very well.
Interesting. I have been in a couple of your presentations before. So this is coming from not what you've mentioned per se, but my understanding, or should I say my interaction with your work. Not so much deeply, but I'd say at the surface level. And from what I gather, it's you engage strongly with conceptual engineering. In your view, what concepts in human rights law are currently, as I'd say, broken and most urgently in need of reshaping or a redesign?
Thank you for the question. So I ended up, just a little side note, but I ended up adopting conceptual engineering was by accident. It was I was doing my I was crafting my taxonomy, and then I ended up finding this is something relatively new so they took it from analytical philosophy, and it is initially an analytical philosophy. Is still a good movement, but initially was designed to solve cases from analytical philosophy, those paradoxes of, the king of France is bald, but there is no king, no French king. So how is it possible that the two sentences are true? So the king of France is false, is bald. How is that possible if there's no king of France? So they created these ideas of, okay, in this case, how can I make the concept of truth or correctiveness to make it adjustable to this context of a sentence that presents itself as true and not true at the same time. But then some theorists, and I would say probably Sally Haslinger is probably the one that I would say that crossed the boundary the most, said, well, that's an interesting idea. Like we can make our concepts better. We can the concept should not only be the concept that is in the dictionary, or that is the one that everyone uses. Why can't we reinvent our concepts or better the concepts? You don't have to do it from scratch. So after saying that, I think there are some concepts within international human rights law that urgently need conceptual engineering, in the sense that they need to be redesigned, they need to be thought in a different way. I would say first, vulnerability, because I think vulnerability tends to be seen as communities or people who are helpless, and which is the problem in terms of being paternalistic and inaccurate, because a lot of these communities and a lot of people who are deemed vulnerable are really strong. Another one, I would say equality, because I think it's still tried in that very Aristotelian way of treating people in the same way. But I think equality should be seen as giving people or redistributing power. So people who are less powerful in a determined situation and are more vulnerable, they should be given more power for the equation to be equal. And I think at last one, probably personhood, because there is still, in the legal sense, and obviously if you go to transhumanism, posthumanism, which is not my area, people will say personhood it should be redefined because nature should be identified as something that has legal personhood. But I'm thinking more about the reasonable person in law. Who's a reasonable person? The reasonable person in law tends to be the white man, the white cis man, the non-disabled, the economically stable. which is very detached from the social reality. Because if the reasonable person is just the white, cis, non-disabled, economically stable person, then it's just a minority of people. So I truly invite people to rethink their concepts, whatever the field they're working, even if it's outside the law. If you're working with, let's say, uh, you know, spatial engineering, what is space, what is engineering, what are debris, if you're talking about this, because you can make powerful changes by changing the concepts themselves. Yeah.
Quite insightful. So having you pointed us towards key areas or in need of redesign, restructuring, or rethinking of what these concepts are all about. In the larger scheme of things, how do you see international law evolving or failing to evolve, or is it stagnating or perhaps even a retrogression? Who knows? And when confronted with these intersectional or multi-layered terms that eventually don't fit a certain neat legal category as as has been over time. Yeah.
So I think we have a problem in that most of the treaties were drafted in the mid 20th century, which means that they have a binary approach of thinking. So it's either you're male or a female, you're white or you're non-white. And what they to solve this and to respond to intersectionality, when people start to say, well, but there are more categories of white and non-white. There's black, there's indigenous, there's uh, Roma, there's a lot of peculiarities. What they did a checklist. So I think right now the European Convention of Human Rights has 18 categories that you can be discriminated against, which, like I said, becomes, and we're joking, but it is a checklist. You go there and you're like, oh yes, I'm discriminated against this, against this. But this is a problem because you have treaties and you have a system that was designed to think of one factor at a time. So you know, I am Brazilian, I speak Portuguese. It's not I am Brazilian and I speak Portuguese and I come from a certain class and it doesn't see the complexity. And I think that because the system wasn't designed to handle complexity, you need some pushbacks. And if you don't bring new conceptual tools, and I'm not saying that my taxonomy is going to solve everything, and I think lots of changes need to happen, uh, you're still going to see justice delivered partially, and you know that partial justice is not justice. So I think there needs to be a big change in terms of how the system works.
Sounds optimistic. Do you think that change is possible? Is something that is coming, or will it take another half a century?
I don't know. I think law is very resistant to change, and law is always catching up. So, and in your area, I think you know this a lot because innovation and AI and big tech. But even in human rights, I think it's if you look at how human rights are treated, it's very much this post Second World War, and you look at this and it's like, oh my God, this way of thinking is so old. I don't. I would like to think that if people see this as a problem, see that, understand that the law is always catching up and the law is slow, they need then to, in the order system. So if lawmakers, they tend to be slow, what you need is you need courts that are more responsive, that are bolder. You need lawyers and claimants that want to change and again are recognized by the courts. You need so I think the agents, people who are playing the field, need to be more need to be bolder. So, in your case, for example, if you have a law or if you have a treaty or something that talks about companies and talks about, let's say, product, you have to see AI as a product. You don't need, hours and you don't need, hundreds of pages of jurisprudence and hundreds of pages of doctrine to say that AI is a product, is a service. Like, you don't need that. You need to be very bold, because the more that you are into this discussion that doesn't really bring about any change, it's better if you are bolder and you bring that into the law, so the law can be more responsive to change.
Everything into perspective. And having mentioned that there's a need in the courts changing how they approach these things, you yourself, you propose a model to help these courts identify this complex layered form of discrimination. And in that sense, how would your taxonomy change in praxis the judicial decision-making process?
So it's going to sound either funny or contradictory. I would say that it helps courts to slow down, and might say, well, but I'm talking about courts, the law is, but it's slowing down in the analysis. I think courts, when they see a discrimination case, they jump to see proportionality or justification. So they want to say, well, but what was the person, was this discriminatory act or supposed allegedly discriminatory act, was it justifiable? If it yes, then it's not discrimination. Was it proportional? So other people in the same situation are treated equally. If so, there's no discrimination. And I think this is they jump the gun, and again, they don't see the other issues at play. So in the case that I treat, one of the cases that I treat in my thesis is the Hammerline versus Finland case. So basically, it was a transgender woman who made the transition. She was married to a woman. And what happened was that the Finnish courts and the European Court of Human Rights decided, well, there is no gay marriage in Finland, so we cannot touch that. Sorry, that's a problem. But there's no discrimination in this case because there is civil union, and a civil union is the same as a marriage, so there is. But what they failed to address is that in this case, transgender people in Finland, they would have to, in this case, because what this transgender woman wanted was to have the documents to have, to present the new gender, but the real gender. So instead of a male, female. And what the Finnish courts and the European courts, they said was, well, basically, you can choose. Either you can stay married and have your documents as male, but that is a violation of what you understand yourself as, or you can divorce and then have a civil union and have your documents presented. And I think it's absurd that the court did not see that as something that is discriminatory, because imagine forcing someone to divorce and then have a different kind of legal protection, even if they grant the same rights, just because they're transgender. This is absurd. Imagine forcing someone to divorce and then acquire a new type of legal protection. So again, it's the taxonomy forces people to not only, because what the European court and the Finnish courts before, what they looked and they looked at the case and was like, well, is there a justification for the difference of treatment? Yes, because we don't recognize gay marriage. Is this proportional? Yeah, because they have the same rights. There's no discrimination. But you're not looking at the bigger picture. And I think it helps them slow down and see, again, the cultural, the structural aspects of the discriminatory act.
As we come towards the end, it's having told us all about your PhD. Now, this is a general question. And since you're towards the end, congratulations. Completing a PhD is evidently an intellectual and deeply personal process. It's like you climbing Mount Everest one or another. Perhaps that's an overshoot, maybe Mont Blanc. So how has this project overall changed the way you see or you perceive the law, the way you see yourself as a researcher, and contextualize in the larger area of academia?
Thank you for the question, and I mean you're completely right. I think it is like climbing Mount Everest. Sometimes you're desperate to get to the summit. Sometimes you're lost in the middle of the fog, right? Mount Everest is not easy to climb. Uh, but I think it changes the way that you, like you said, like you see the law and how you are as a person and as a researcher. I think in my case, I always said, and I don't know if that's me not having a healthy self-esteem, but I never thought of myself as a creative person, because when I think about creative people, I think of people who paint and, they do arts, and I'm not good at that. But I think because we talk about conceptual engineering and looking at things in a different way, I think that made me realize or made me more creative or realize creativeness that I had and that I didn't know about. And also to see law in a more complex way in the sense that it's more layered. You can't just see law as it is. You have to look at law and think, well, is what is it talking about? What's behind this? What's actually this treaty being? Because again, in the example that I gave, if you look at the European Court of Human Rights, the 18, and I'm guessing it might be more or less, but 18 protected characteristics, you may look at it and it's like, wow, this is amazing. They're protecting, people in a lot of ways, but they're not, because they're doing the checklist exercise. So having that, and I think it when you look at it, and when you're beginning, your studies, or you're beginning in the field, you tend to see that in a very naive way. It's like, wow, it protects everyone. And I think not being as naive, or being a little bit more savvy and seeing things as more complex, and complex problems require complex solutions, I think that that is something that also changed the way that I see law. But yeah.
Nice. Lovely hearing your creative part towards generating this magnum opus. So as we wind, definitely there is subsequent people who are going to follow you in seeking knowledge or enriching the uh, research field. Is there something? Not is there something? I will urge you to say to give pointers and to to insight. Let me use insight. Is it to insight or give them much more esteem to pursue whatever it is that they want? You mentioned that you did not perceive yourself as a creative figure. However, as you move on, you realize that creativity does not necessarily have to be in one particular form. It takes various forms, which is good. I think creativity is a byproduct of childhood. So could you give us a little bit on how best to carry on?
I think one of the things that I might have repeated a couple of times, but I think because it is uh, the way I think forward is be bold, be bold in whatever you do. Be Don't be afraid of being yourself and having opinions. And again, you're not going to please everyone. People will think, your interpretation of law or your concept is not the right one. But if you have the basis for your argument, if you have the basis for your view, then that's okay. Because again, people who end up making change, and I think all of us want to make change in one way or another, are the people who dare to think and to do things differently. And that requires both boldness and courage. So I would say be bold, think outside the box, and do not care about people who do not follow, you in the beginning. So yeah, I would say regardless of their position, if they're starting their PhD journey, if they're early career researcher, if they are a person who's suffering discrimination, be bold, be there, make a complaint, go against, make yourself heard. I think this is where the change happens. Yeah.
That's nice. I like how you put it. Basically, uh, enrage the outdated critics and may we dare. So thank you, Bernardo, for joining us today. So lovely having you, and you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you so much. Bye
Of
bye.
course.